Welcome to day 1 of the 30-day transformational challenge. Today we're going to be talking about the dangers of always and never. So I want you to think for a moment. How many times do you make those statements? Such as, you always get your way, or I never get to do that. How many times do we say those? And why do we say those statements? If we think about it for a moment, those statements can be very damaging, not only for ourselves, but for others. Think about the last time you got in an argument. Maybe you got in an argument with your spouse, or a friend, or a parent, or even a child. And all of a sudden, those accusations started flying. You always get your way. You never tell me you love me. Those statements can be so damaging because they are limiting statements. They don't allow the Lord to get into the situation. And what's even more damaging is we come into a casualty covenant with the enemy. The enemy wants us to make those statements. Why? Because then we don't allow the Lord to work in our lives. We shut the door. We shut down. Think about when a statement like that is made to you. What do you immediately do? Does it shut you down? Do you go to defend yourself? What do you do when that is said to you? And even sometimes more importantly, what does the other person do when you make that statement? So let me give you another thought. What happens when you say that statement about yourself? So I want you to think for a moment. Have you ever made a statement, an always or a never statement about yourself? I always go after the wrong man. What are you saying? You're saying there's no hope. That you're already making a statement that I always go after the wrong man. Well, are you going to allow the Lord to work in your life and bring the right man? No, you're saying I always go after the wrong man. You're not saying, Lord, bring me the right man. You're making an always statement. It's a limiting statement. It's a judgmental statement. So I want us to think about today of what are we doing in these statements? What are we doing to ourselves? What are we doing to others? And how can we change that? That is part of the exercise that you are going to do today. So as I look at my notes here, let me give you some examples of those always and never statements. You never listen. I always have to do it your way. My mother never loved me. I never get what I want. Think of those statements. How many times you made those statements? And are those statements true? Are they really true? Are those statements, no matter what, we put a box around it and we say, okay, so therefore, in every situation, you are never listening to me. No, of course not. And my mother never loved me? Really? There was never once a point where she showed you love. Okay? So why do we use these statements? Let's think about it a minute. We are saying the statement to have someone or ourselves be obligated to us. It's almost like an obligation statement. You're saying, okay, you never do this. Well, then guess what? That person's thinking, okay, I never do that, so I guess I better live up to that. And they fall into an obligation. Or are you trying to make them feel guilty? Or do you yourself feel guilty? If you're making that statement about yourself, are you feeling guilty? I always go after the wrong man. Or feeling sorry for yourself. Or are you saying it to put someone else on the defensive? Think about if you were in an argument with someone and you make an always or never statement. Then what do they naturally do? They want to defend themselves. So they're going to come back with the same sort of statement. They're going to come back at you and say, well, you always or you never. And then where does it go? It doesn't go anywhere at all. And you are left feeling invalidated, unappreciated, and guilty. Because why? We're trying to justify our actions and behaviors. You don't want someone saying that to you, thus, why would you say it to someone else? But then let's look at a minute and let's think about, for us to look at an inventory of why we make those statements. So this is the exercise that I want you to do today. I want you to take out a piece of paper and I want you to write down these categories or these questions that I have for you. So, who are you speaking to when you use these statements? When you most commonly use these statements, who are you typically speaking to? Do you say them to yourself? Do you say them to your spouse? Do you say them to a friend, a relative, a child? So that's the first question I want you to examine. I want you to examine, who are you making these statements to? All right? Second question is, what situation do you find yourself in when you are speaking these statements? Are you frustrated? Are you sad? Are you angry? Why are you making these statements? Typically, these are going to be negative emotions, but you need to find out why you're making these statements. When are you saying them? What is going on? Number 3, what response do you get from others when you use these statements? What is their reaction? What do they do? If those statements are said to me, most often I shut down. Or if I'm in a feisty mood, I may try to defend myself. Or does it escalate to anger? Or even probably the saddest one of all is the person just dismisses you. All right, how about number 4? Who is speaking these always and never statements to you? So now we've gone from when you say them to when they're spoken to you. Who is making those statements to you? And lastly, when those statements are spoken to you, how does it make you feel? What is your reaction? What is your response? Because typically we're not going to respond. We're going to react. So what is your reaction? All right, so now I want you to think for a moment. You've written all those down. And this is kind of an ongoing exercise because we're not going to solve this overnight, but we can certainly change our behavior and we can change the way in which we speak to others. So I want you to think about not retaliating when people use that always and never statement. Because you know what? This is what the enemy wants you to do. The enemy immediately wants you to start retaliating and get into that argument and get into that debate that never goes anywhere. Because remember what it says in the Word. We do not fight with flesh and blood. Okay, you're not fighting with another person. You're immediately going into battle with the enemy. Right? Number 2, do not believe what that other person is saying, or even what you're saying to yourself. Why would you say that about yourself? Okay. And number 3, immediately don't become defensive. Don't go into that defensive mode of defending yourself, because again, you're not fighting with the person, you're fighting with the enemy. So, most importantly, how are you going to repair your relationship with yourself and the Lord in these situations? How can you stop this pattern or this cycle from continuing? Because it really is a cycle that keeps continuing. And the more frustrated or angry or upset we become, the more we say these statements. The more that we really come and put ourselves into a state where the enemy wants us to be. The enemy wants us to be down on ourselves. The enemy wants us to be there and make these statements, because then we're defeated and we won't rise up to our true self. So, here's a little exercise again that I want you to do. And this may be hard at first, but if you really take the time to do it, you're going to get into this pattern of, wow, how many times do I say that a day? So every time you make an always or never statement, this is what I want you to do. I want you to stop yourself. And I want you to call upon the Lord to help you, to say something different, to say something better, a true statement about yourself or about the other person, that you will not come into an agreement with the enemy. So let's look at that example that I gave you earlier. I always go after the wrong type of men. So what can you say instead? When I do not take the time with the Lord and pray for the right man to come into my life, I may end up with the wrong type of men that are not the best for me. Look at what you did right there. You took a potentially self-defeating, negative comment, negative pattern, and you immediately flipped it around, and even more importantly, you included the Lord in that statement. And you called on the Lord to help you in doing so. So instead of saying, I always, you immediately stop yourself and say, well, wait a minute. I'm not going to say that anymore. And the same thing is true if you are talking to someone else. When you go to say, you always, no. Let's stop a minute. Let's take inventory a minute of what we are really saying to that other person. Okay? Then, at that time, we can take the time to reflect on those assured statements that the Lord gives us. Think about what it says in His Word. I will never leave you nor forsake you. What else does He say? The Lord is always with me. Okay, and I think sometimes we find those statements very hard to believe. Why? Well, because think about the reverse. Think about what we are saying to others and ourselves. You always, you never, which we know are not true statements. So then we have trouble believing that the Lord is true to His word. He will never leave us or forsake us. He is always with us. So we have trouble believing that from the Lord, because we get so much in that pattern of those negative statements that the enemy wants us to believe. The enemy wants us to come into an agreement with. No, 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 no. We want to come into an agreement with the statements the Lord is giving us to say. That's when we counteract it most importantly. So if we can get in the habit or in the pattern or in the way of saying of those always and never statements and making a true statement of what the Lord is saying, then we're walking in truth. We're not walking in condemnation. We're not walking in anger and frustration and all those other things that get in the way of us really walking in the Lord's truth. So again, with statements you make to and about others, okay, again, stop yourself. Take inventory. Maybe it's best to start when you are not in an argument with someone or you're not in a disagreement. But maybe you're talking with someone else and you say, you know, he always does that, or she always does that, or he never does this, or he never does that. Stop yourself and take an inventory. And why are you making these statements? What is really missing? What are you really seeking from that other person? Why are you making that statement about them? Are you saying that they're always getting their way, or are you saying that you feel like maybe you don't get equal say, or you don't get equal time, or you don't get equal attention in the situation? So the next time that you're talking with that person that you're making that always and never statement about, maybe you can say, you know, let's look at something a little bit different here. So next time we're going to do something, can we do what I want to do, and then the next time we do what you want to do? Come into that agreement so you feel validated, because often that's what's missing in those always and never statements. We feel invaluable, not invaluable, we feel not valuable. We want to become invaluable. Okay, but we have to understand where that's coming from, what's being stirred up in our spirit, because this is all about this transformation process that we're going through in these next 30 days is all about healing our hearts. It's healing our hearts from those darts and daggers that come in and disrupt our lives and make us upset that the enemy wants us to be walking in all the time. What if you were to take an inventory, like I said, about that statement, my mother never loved me? What if you took the time to write down all the examples of all those times your mother showed you love? Wouldn't that be an eye-opener? You could probably write for days and days. But just even a few examples will make you realize that I can't speak that statement anymore, because it's not truth. The Lord wants us to speak in truth. He wants us to speak forth His truth. And if we make always and never statements, we're not walking in His truth. Only when we're speaking about Him and saying that He will always be there for us. So what are you going to do when others are saying those statements to you? What are you going to do? How about if you stop them and you say, I don't accept that from you? Well, guess what? That's immediately going to stop them cold in their tracks. They're going to be like, what? Huh? What? You don't accept that? Because what they're wanting to do, or what the enemy's wanting you to do, is immediately get into that battle. But if you stop and say, I don't accept that from you. I don't accept what you're trying to say to me, or I don't accept that statement from you, then guess what? It's going to put the brakes on. And hopefully it will open up a conversation. Maybe not in the heat of the moment, but maybe later in another conversation where you can say, well, wait a minute, that's not true. Let me give you an example of that. So you're wanting to see when people make that statement about you, or you're making that statement about others, like I said before, what is behind it? What is really the issue? So I'll use a perfect example. Maybe your spouse says something to you, you never fill in the blank. Okay? Are they not feeling appreciated? Are they not feeling valued? Are they not feeling like you care? What is really behind that? So you need to take inventory of that. Okay, because there's something behind it. Okay? And lastly, if you're in a relationship with someone who's using always and never statements, you've tried to see, you've tried to correct your behavior, you've made strides, but they still continue, then maybe you need to take inventory of if you need to remain in that relationship. Because if they're going to continue down that road of putting you in that situation and speaking for things that are not true, then maybe that's not the best relationship for you to be in. Because you don't want the enemy to be using that person against you each and every time. The last thing I would like to give you that is probably the most important of all the steps I've given you is to go through and find scriptures of where the Lord says always and never. And write those scriptures down. Memorize those scriptures. And say those scriptures over and over again to yourself so that you get into your heart of what the Lord means to you. Just like it does in Matthew 28:20. I am with you always. And he is, and we know that because we can call on him at any time, day or night, night and day. He is always there for us. We just sometimes forget, or we do not take the time to even realize that. But if that's in our spirit, and we know that, and we've remembered the scripture, we can call upon it. And it gives us peace, and it gives us comfort. How about for Hebrews 3:5? I will never leave you nor forsake you. Yes, people can leave and forsake us all the time, but the Lord will not. He never will. That's why he wants us to know his nature. That's why he wants us to know him so profoundly and trust in him and look at his always and never statements, because they are in truth, but not what we say about ourselves and not what we say about others. So I thank you for joining me today for this day one of our 30-day transformation challenge. It is my hope that you will join me on this challenge each and every day so that your life can be transformed and you can begin to walk in God's truth for your life and over your life and be transformed through him. So thank you. Be blessed. Until tomorrow. Bye-bye.